Today I want to talk to you about the best short story I have ever read, which is appropriate for February because it was written by Roger Zelazny. Not only is it a wonderful distillation of everything great about vintage science fiction, it also expresses a love for the history of the written word. The references that Zelazny uses in the story are astounding. I think it is one of the best ways to get into reading Zelazny, and the barrier to entry could not be lower. The story I'm talking about is A Rose for Ecclesiastes, and it is a 35-ish page short story. It's about 12,000 words. I'm going to put a link in the description to a audiobook and written version that you can read for free. I don't know how or why they did it, but the podcast Escape Pod got the rights to publish it. I implore anyone watching to go check it out. To give a little history about the story, it was published in 1963 and was nominated for a Hugo Award for Best Short Story in 1964. It did not win that award, which is a bit of a joke considering the other short stories that were nominated. Savage Pellucidar was written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, who'd been dead for like 18 years. I don't know why he was nominated. Code 3 by Rick Raphael was just okay. It was a story about gigantic atomic-powered cars on 8-lane wide highways where they go like 400 miles an hour. It was one of those pieces that's very of its time and doesn't really hold up nowadays. The winner, No Truce with Kings, was a mediocre post-apocalyptic novella written by Poul Anderson. A Rose for Ecclesiastes was seriously the best one out of all of those. I've read them all. You can check out my thoughts on everything that was nominated for the Hugo Awards in 1964 in a video I'll put in the description. Newsflash, the Hugo Awards have always been kind of a joke when it comes to sus nominations and wins, but that's not what this video is about. When I mentioned in the intro that this story is a distillation of everything great about vintage science fiction, here's a quote from Zelazny that backs that up. This is in the notes section of Threshold, the collected stories of Roger Zelazny, Volume 1. I had a strong sentimental attachment to what is now called space opera. I had long wanted to do something of that sort when I began selling fiction in the 60s. It was too late. Almost. The space program had already invalidated the Mars and Venus of Edgar Rice Burroughs. Almost. If I wanted to do homage, I would have to act quickly and do my best. I knew that I would only be allowed one shot at each world, and then I would have to leave the solar system. This quote sums up not only the amount of effort Zelazny put into the story, it also helps you understand the time in which Zelazny was writing. This was a transitional period for the science fiction genre. Science had caught up to these fantastical writings and had turned them into anachronisms. I think that is one of the reasons why Zelazny is not as popular now as he was then. It is hard for modern readers to decide where he fits into the great conversation of science fiction. Some people think of him as being new wave, while others accuse him of writing in an outdated style. Let's talk about A Rose for Ecclesiastes. To give a summary of what the story is about, we are following Gallinger, a linguist and a poet, on a mission to Mars to meet with the native Martians. A group of humanoids a lot like us that live very long lives and have not had children for hundreds of years. It is implied that they are infertile. Gallinger is there to translate their religious and historical texts. This mission is a mix of diplomatic and anthropological. As I say that, does anthropology work in this context? Anthropology is a study of the nature of man, its cultures, society, and linguistics, both past and present. Is there a term for the same study, but when it comes to sapient beings from another planet? Also, how did it apply to a group on Earth that weren't descended from humans? Like, what if somehow we found Neanderthals had a society? Is that anthropology, or is that just archaeology? What if they have a culture? Anyways, I think that is a question for another video. This story is about Gallinger going through this mission, then things start to change. He starts to form a bond with Mars and the people on it. I don't want to give any spoilers for where the story goes, but I am going to talk about the first few pages just as a way to give you context not only for the story but for Zelazny's writing style. On my second reading of A Rose for Ecclesiastes using this book, I realized there are so many references to literary and religious texts. In the first 3 pages of this 30-page short story, Zelazny references Shakespeare, the Mahabharata, and the Bible. They aren't referenced in some kind of like, I am very smart kind of way. He uses them as shorthand for describing a feeling the protagonist has during interactions with different people, which is appropriate considering he is a translator and a linguist and a poet specializing in ancient texts, which is the whole reason for him being sent on the mission to Mars. The Shakespeare reference is him describing his interaction with the captain of the ship. The captain is kind of boisterous and a little too loud out, and I think Gallinger doesn't think that the captain is qualified for his position, and he refers to their conversation as Hamlet speaking to Claudius. And now that I'm thinking about it, at first I was like, well, who's Hamlet and who's Claudius? But I'm pretty sure Gallinger is referring to himself as Claudius, who is morally weak and, manipulative and cunning. I don't think he was thinking of that aspect of Claudius. I think he was thinking of the smooth talker who's good at getting his way and is very intelligent. Anyways, the fact that Zelazny is putting this into a short story about Mars is just incredible. Keep this in mind as you read the story. Like Gallinger, he's a little high on his own supply. He thinks he's the best thing since sliced bread, and in some ways he is. He's like a 6'6" redhead that knows judo and speaks a billion different languages and is just cool and smart. As you go through this story, you will see him change, and by the end of the story, it's hard to see that hyper-confident man from the beginning of the story. Reading this a second time has greatly changed how I feel about it. Moments that were mundane or not very cogent to the part of the story they take place in are mind-blowing on the second read. Somehow Zelazny has managed to give me an even greater appreciation for what I already consider my favorite short story of all time. When he refers to the Mahabharata in the story, it is just shorthand between him and another linguist when they're trying to explain that the Martian texts are both a history of their civilization and a text used for religious purposes. There's enough context there that you don't have to know what the Mahabharata is to understand what he's getting at, but with that extra context, it just adds a little more to the story. The Mahabharata is one of the two major Sanskrit epics of ancient India. Zelazny uses this as a reference in the story because the main character's specialty is translating texts from Sanskrit and other very early written languages. I like that he takes the time to include these frames of reference that would only be used by someone like the main character. And considering he's talking to another linguist, it makes sense. He does a great job of really getting the reader into the mindset of Gallinger. One of the things that made Roger Zelazny a master of his craft was his ability to add layers to a story so that no matter where you're at in your life, when you approach his writing, you are going to get something new out of it. His stories are fun, easy to read, and always rewarding to come back to. His references in his stories are like little treats you are rewarded with as your grasp of the written word grows. You learn more about Shakespeare, you'll see more Shakespeare in his writing. You learn more about the ancient epics from the beginnings of civilization. You will see them in his stories. Just a quick aside, imagine reading the Bhagavad Gita and then reading Lord of Light, or having a grasp of Buddhism and reading Lord of Light. It's all there. You don't have to have that. I knew very little the first time I read Lord of Light, and afterwards spent a lot of time learning about that stuff, and it also altered how I look at that novel. The other example I have is his biblical example, which is also very interesting. Here's a sample of the text from the story for context. The scene is him being led into a temple that is controlled by the women on Mars. He is with the linguist that he was talking to about the historical text. She dropped her eyes and seized my hand. I almost jerked it away. It will look better if I enter leading you. I swallowed my comments and followed her like Samson in Gaza. Of course, that references the events described in Judges 16, 1-3, which is about the time Samson went to Gaza and spent the night with a prostitute, and when the locals figured out he was there, they decided to wait in ambush to kill him. In this passage, you get the trepidation that the main character is feeling in two different ways. He almost jerks his hand away from her because he is either not comfortable with her touching his hand, or it kind of gets in the way of his masculinity and being the one to lead the way. Then you get that re-emphasized when he makes the reference to Samson in Gaza. I think maybe it's a little bit of paranoia on his part of a woman leading him into the lioness's mouth. Another thing you'll see throughout the story is Gallinger's masculinity working as both a help and a hindrance, and you'll see his view of himself and how he functions in a matriarchal society change throughout the story. This reread has seriously blown my mind. The first time I went through this, I barely noticed any of this. I just had a great time with a beautifully written story, and going back to it and taking the time to parse out the language has been far more rewarding than I ever expected. When it comes to the themes in the story, without spoiling anything, I think you should keep an eye out for parts of the story that involve prophets and the interpretation of religious and historical texts. Gallinger, being a linguist and a poet, gives the reader an opportunity to reflect on the things that he is studying. You can spend your time trying to figure out why the texts matter and whether prophecy has an impact on a civilization that has been led down a fatalistic path. The rest of the story is about Gallinger's time with the Martians. He meets a beautiful dancer in the temple and begins to fall in love with her. I don't want to talk about it too much because it's only a 12,000 word story, and covering any more of it is just going to spoil the entire reason for reading it. This story gives you a beautiful and tragic exploration of a dying world by a man who comes to learn more about himself through the story. Gallinger makes a wonderful protagonist that can annoy you, make you roll your eyes, and make you fall in love with a beautiful version of Mars that has never existed. The way Zelazny wrote this story when it comes to exploration of the Martian landscape and its people just adds to the overall tragedy and sense of loss that you feel when you read this story. I cannot recommend it enough. I beg all of you watching to go give it a chance. And if you're already a fan of Zelazny, this is a must read. Please go check it out and let me know your thoughts on it. I want to end this with a quote from Zelazny about the main character Gallinger. Not only does it give a bit of insight into Zelazny's feelings toward the character, you also get the reason why he wrote the story. This is from Threshold, the first volume in the collected stories of Roger Zelazny. Zelazny usually gave non-committal answers when asked if the poet Gallinger had any resemblance to Zelazny himself, but he did have a very personal response to letter writer Clara on this very subject. You asked me why I hated Gallinger so in A Rose for Ecclesiastes. The answer is that I hated him because he was me. Once in my life, I let a beautiful thing die, and now it can never be. Details are not important in that they would add nothing. The story says what it must and stands or falls on its own merits. But you're right in your observation that it's a sad story, despite the fact that you felt crushed and even cheated. Life is full of these things, and one of them motivated this tale. I didn't want it to end that way, but it had to, because he was me. Let me know in the comments if you've read this beautiful story. Let me know if you're going to read it. Please give it a chance. Thanks for watching. And with that, I'll see you next time.